Nature American Spring Live on KRWG Public Media April 29th, 30th, and May 1st at 7 p.m. More at pbs.org/American Spring Live. Major support for Nature American Spring Live and this related local programming was provided by the National Science Foundation and the Anne Ray Foundation.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Up front this week, when a gasoline pipeline burst late last year in southern New Mexico, local officials wanted to make sure it wouldn't happen again. But the county and states don't have much authority over the line. Mallory Falk investigates.
Late one night in December 2018, several residents of a small rural area near Anthony heard an explosion and smelled gas. A gasoline pipeline had burst, spilling more than 10,000 barrels of fuel into a drainage ditch. The pipeline was temporarily shut off and repaired. A cleanup crew recovered much of the gas, but tens of thousands of gallons soaked into the ground, contaminating soil and groundwater. Nearly 2 months after the spill, cleanup efforts were still underway, and the site still smelled like gasoline.
It smells like I'm standing about 4 feet from a gasoline pump.
Shannon Reynolds is a Doña Ana County commissioner. He stood near the drain, which was being excavated.
You can see behind me, there's a big backhoe that's actually digging the dirt down, and they're still bringing the damaged soil, or the soil that actually has gasoline in it, and they're piling it up on the side of the ditch here for later removal to a safe location.
Reynolds wants to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, but the county and the state of New Mexico don't have much control over the pipeline. That's because it's an interstate pipeline, spanning 3 states and nearly 300 miles. The Santa Fe Pacific Pipeline runs from El Paso to Tucson, pumping more than 3,000 barrels of gas every hour. It's owned by energy giant Kinder Morgan, one of the largest pipeline companies in North America. Interstate pipelines are regulated by the federal government, specifically the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA. The agency oversees about 2.5 million miles of pipelines nationwide. The state does oversee the remediation process whenever there's a spill involving a water contaminant, like gasoline. Justin Ball is with the New Mexico Environment Department. When a pipeline bursts or a transfer truck rolls over on the highway, his office gets involved.
They need to tell us what they spilled, how they spilled it, where they spilled it, who they are, who owns the property, who's the operator, basic information, and need to tell us within 24 hours of the spill.
Then they come up with a remediation plan, which his department has to approve and monitor.
There is a specific process for them to clean up the site and for us to overview it and give our judgments on that.
But when it comes to actual pipeline, the state doesn't have much power. PHMSA is the one making sure Kinder Morgan takes corrective measures to figure out what caused the pipeline break and work to prevent other leaks in the future. It also determines when the company can turn the line back on. That makes Commissioner Shannon Reynolds uneasy.
One of the things that I was concerned with when we first started talking about this is the fact that they restarted the gas line before they actually knew what the problem was.
And he says they didn't perform internal testing on the rest of the pipeline before they turned on the gas to see if other sections were compromised.
I'm also concerned that because those pipes are old, that we run the risk of another pipe bursting somewhere near this community in a very short amount of time.
Reynolds says the state can address the cleanup.
What I'd rather do is I'd rather address the cause and use some preventive measures to make sure that we don't have a spill like this again, ever.
One measure he'd like to see: automatic shutoff valves near residential areas. So when there's a sudden dramatic drop in pressure, the gas stops flowing immediately. Alan Four is a spokesperson with Kinder Morgan. He understands these concerns, but stresses the company followed federal regulations.
The agency that regulates our operations said it was safe to put the pipeline back in operation. So we followed their regulations, which include a pressure test. That's the standard process for understanding the integrity of a pipeline. That was done.
Forrest says pipelines are the safest way to transport critical products like gas, and that the vast majority of these products make it to their final destinations.
That means the gasoline in this line gets to our facilities and then to gas stations and then to your cars. So it's the best way to transport. It's not a perfect system. We're always trying to make it better. And you do have incidents, and what you do from those is you learn from those, and you make sure that you review exactly what happened. And right now, that will help us and other operators and the regulatory agencies better understand how we can make our pipeline systems even safer.
Still, some local officials like Shannon Reynolds would like more of a hand in making the pipeline system safer, since it runs through local counties, and they're the ones affected when things go wrong. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Mallory Falk.
Important story there from Mallory Falk, and joining us now to talk about the transition away from fossil fuels is an expert from New Energy Economy, Mariel Nanasi. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Alarming story there, and this has been repeated all over the country. We've had pipelines burst, people forced from their homes. The pipeline goes right back on without, some critics would say, any kind of proper testing, raising the risk of another break. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, sorry to use that analogy when we're talking about climate change, when it comes to the damage that fossil fuels cause and why folks like you are talking about this on programs like this and elsewhere and talking about it to legislators.
At this point, it's wreaking havoc on our lives, and it's wreaking havoc whether it's people maybe have seen when they go and they turn on their water and they can light up their water and it becomes on fire from fracking. We're talking about explosions of pipelines and massive damage. And then what the other side of that is what you mentioned, is climate disruption with all the wildfires and the tornadoes and the hurricanes and people being displaced from their homes, people dying from the catastrophic wildfires that happened just in California and close to home. So yeah, this is a really important, probably the most important issue that we are facing in our lives today. And so we've taken measures to address them in the legislature this session. But the problem is that unfortunately there's been almost radio or TV silence about it. This is the most important issue, and there's been so little actually really said or done about it.
And why do you think that is?
I think that is because energy companies are the wealthiest companies in the history of money. There's more lobbyists in our own legislature in the oil and gas and fossil fuel industries, and there's more in the national Congress, more lobbyists per congressperson. I think they say it's something like 7 or 13, somewhere between 7 to 13, I don't know what the latest figure is, of lobbyists in our Congress.
For each member of Congress, 7 to 13 lobbyists.
For each member. And so not only is there climate disruption, but there's an undermining of our democracy. And people have been complaining, I've been in the legislature almost every single day this session, about the intense influence of the oil and gas industry in our legislature. I mean, it's almost as if, like the cartoons where the eyes are like popping out, with money signs on them. And that's what it's been like, where when oil and gas talks in the legislature about even the most minor regulations on oil and gas or fossil fuels, the intense the intense influence that they're having in those committee hearing rooms and with those Congress, with the legislators themselves.
Tell me, I'm sure you get this question all the time, the flip side of this, those who are promoting fossil fuels, whether they be the companies themselves or folks who benefit financially from fossil fuels in other ways, they, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, will demonize environmental groups and environmentalists. Tell me about your organization, New Energy Economy, and how you started, how you're funded, and what exactly you do, what your mission is.
So New Energy Economy, this is actually our 15th year in existence, and it was actually started by two doctors. I became the executive director in 2010, but I started as a volunteer in 2008, which is note to all listeners, if you want to get involved in something that you're passionate about, go and volunteer and make them fall in love with you. And then ultimately I was hired first as the senior policy advisor and then the executive director. And so our mission is really to address the climate challenge with bold solutions and to phase out fossil fuels as quickly as absolutely possible and replace them with renewables. And in doing so, to do that to create a just transition in that path, in that transformation.
Okay. How did you personally decide I want to volunteer for this organization?
To be perfectly honest, I was a civil rights lawyer before I got into this field. And I went to a conference, a Bioneers. People might know who the Bioneers are. And I went to a Bioneers conference in 2008. And I was so moved. I understood about climate change, but I didn't understand the urgency of it. And I thought, how can I hear this and know this intellectually, and then look at my children in their eyes and say, I knew about it, and I didn't do anything to change it. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to use my talents in this regard. And I didn't know anything. I didn't know where our electricity came from. And at first, I found out that coal is the single greatest driver of climate disruption and fossil fuel usage. And I thought, we live in New Mexico, in the land of the sunzia. That's on our flag. And yet we have so little solar in our energy portfolio. El Paso Electric, which is the monopoly utility that is here in Las Cruces, and PNM, which is where I live, is the monopoly utility there. El Paso Electric has 1% solar in its portfolio, and PNM has 3% solar in its portfolio, and the rest, 99% for EPE, El Paso Electric, is fossil fuels and nuclear. And with PNM, it's 90%. And so here we have abundant resources, solar and wind resources in New Mexico, and they are not taking advantage of it. So I thought simply, well, let's just close coal. Let's start there. And then EPE has more gas than PNM does. They both have a lot of nuclear in their system. But let's transition as quickly as possible. And I thought, oh, I just have to explain to them. Maybe they just don't understand. But I found out that both of those utility monopolies have a perverse incentive to invest in those big fossil fuel centralized generation. And that's what's really so amazing about this moment that we're in, that we have an opportunity to create a new energy economy. Why? Because we have been in a centralized electric generation. One big nuclear plant or coal plant or gas plant far away, and those huge transmission lines that take the electricity from that plant to the load centers, Las Cruces or Albuquerque or Santa Fe. But we no longer need that, because we are it's like innovation, going from dial-up telephones to cell phones. we would never go back to dial-up, though at the time dial-up was amazing. But now we have cell phones, and I remember the time when we said a phone could take a picture, and now that's like ubiquitous, right? We take selfies all the time, right? And so right now we have this enormous opportunity to invest in solar and wind close to the load centers and not have a monopoly utility have centralized generation.
Yeah, and just to catch people up to speed, while some of our viewers may know about this incentive that you mentioned, others may not. It was a subject in the Public Regulation Commission election recently that in New Mexico, utility companies actually have the ability to make a profit off of building those fossil fuel powered electric plants. So even if they don't actually need the plant, they will make a profit. It is part of the law, correct?
It is part of the law. It's called, bear with me just for a minute, they get a almost guaranteed return on equity, a return on their assets. I don't know exactly what the number is for El Paso Electric, but for PNM, it's a 9.575%.
Yeah.
And it's
so
about
almost a 10% profit, no risk, because you just charge it to the customer. And
on all those large assets.
On all those assets. So you build it and you make a profit on it.
And that's why they want to own those assets, and they want to have bigger assets, even if they only use it a little tiny part of the time. So El Paso Electric or PNM might have a gas plant that they only use 2%.
In the summer, when the air conditioning is going crazy. This was something that was raised in the PRC election, and it was mind-boggling to hear about it. Again, this is part of policy that often only comes out during elections, unfortunately, or on public media.
But it's a really important big deal because it's driving policy.
Yeah.
And we have some things in the legislature currently that are an antidote to that. And that's what's extraordinarily exciting. About this time.
We'll get to that. I want to ask you though first, because you've heard this not only in New Mexico but all around the country, particularly in recent time with the Green New Deal that's been proposed nationally, that there are skeptics who say, renewable energy can't meet the nation's energy needs. What's your response when people say that?
Well, I'd like to talk about New Mexico because probably that's where who your viewers are. So I'd like to have this sort of local perspective. We are extraordinarily fortunate in New Mexico because this isn't true all over the United States, but it is true for New Mexico. So I'd like to focus there, if I may. So let's call it the New Mexico Green New Deal. And that is, can we get to 100% renewables? And the answer is yes. And one thing is that I looked at something called 8760 data. And do you know what 8760 data is? It's how many hours of the year there are. And when wind companies have to go and get their financing, they have to show how strong their wind capacity is to deliver. Well, it delivers in New Mexico, especially near here, and in Torrance County, and between 8 p.m. and about 5 a.m. And then if you figure, even in the wintertime, the sun is from 7 to 5, okay? Then we're looking at a tiny window between 5 and 8 p.m. at night, and in the morning between 5 and 7. Now, of course, we have, it's light till 7 o'clock these days already.
And storage is getting better with batteries, et cetera.
Storage is not only getting better, it's becoming more cost effective.
Right.
And we're seeing it happening in Colorado and Arizona. Our neighbors have stated that something very interesting happened last year in Arizona. They instituted the regulatory utility agency there. There it's called the Arizona Corporation Commission. Here we have the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, but they're the same agency. they instituted a moratorium on gas. Why? Because they said, hey, solar plus storage and wind plus storage can meet the needs of our customer demand, and we are concerned that if we keep on building these gas plants, especially only using it very little of the time, we're going to have what's called stranded assets, these big, huge, multi-$100 million centralized generation, and then they're going to have to become economically obsolete in maybe 5 years, or 7 years. And so why don't we start thinking about other ways to address this issue, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's storage. And the thing is that, I mean, it's so exciting. The solar plus storage and wind plus storage in both Colorado and Arizona are cheaper than current gas plants.
Okay, so we've established you can do this, particularly in a state like New Mexico with lots of sun and lots of wind. But how about the economic argument? We know New Mexico gets a lot of revenue from fossil fuels. How do you respond to folks who say, look, we still need to protect that industry because we get all this money, all this tax revenue from them?
It's a very important question. And Martin Luther King talked about something called false choices. And at some point, and I hope it's not too late, to be very honest with you, we are going to have to say we can no longer afford to have these fossil fuels. I mean, the current science is that we have to drastically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And that's also including in our minds. And it's including in the budgets of New Mexico or local budgets. Why? We must do this. We must make the change for survival. So we can no longer afford to have a crisis of imagination. And I think that we can do it. We can't say, oh, we're going to invest in something so that we can put that money into schools, but meanwhile that investment is going to make it harder for us to have water or harder for us to have a safe climate or whatever the other enormous issues, including this huge spill that we just saw about.
I like the way that you framed this, because this is fascinating that on the national level, you may have seen that the new Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, better AOC is what she's got the shorthand for now, right? That's proposed the Green New Deal, has said that this was part of her intention in proposing the Green New Deal. She is being accused of thinking too big. Well, she said that's just the point, that we cannot lose in America this idea that we can do big things. I wonder your take on this, because beyond the fact of that issue of thinking big, much of the news coverage that I see of this ignores the fact when folks say it's just a crazy idea that on the military alone, we spend around $700 billion with a B dollars every year. And so there is money available. It's just that the allocation of the money is maybe different than what the scenario you described would demand.
And the thing is that I think that people are hungry for something refreshing and something to believe in. And that's why she's, been so incredibly popular. I think that they said there was a idea that said if we could add 5 cents to every stock trade that is made, 5 cents, we could put on renewables for the entire country.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of priorities, and we go back to where we started this whole conversation about the control of the fossil fuel industry, even as clearly in our legislation, but in on TV and on radio and in the whole discourse. And it's time that we break through. Really, that's what it's going to take. Break through that notion that we can't.
Yeah.
This is one thing I do love about America, which is we're Americans. And yes, we can do this. And there's something super refreshing about that. And the fact is when people stand up and demonstrate courage and speak in a way that is hopeful and take action, which actually is the thing that inspires that hope, then change can happen.
Yeah. You know, I don't want to leave this hanging because we only have a few minutes left, but one of the things that you talked about when I asked you about the potential for renewable energy, you spoke about it in terms of New Mexico, and I've heard very few people, even critics of renewable energy, disagree that we are ideally suited for renewables with lots of sun and lots of wind. A little hard to ignore. But one of the things that you hear often on the national scene is when folks say, well, there's a lot of places that maybe not as well suited, is we have the example of Germany as one country with lots of clouds, not ideally suited to renewable energy, but has pursued this in a vigorous way so much more than the United States.
We're losing in a lot of ways. I think that we're losing our children. Not only are we having a crisis of imagination, we're having this crisis of hope and of belief that we can do things. There's people all over the country, all over the world, who are doing innovative things. I think that it's really imperative that people, individuals, stand up and make their demands.
And beyond voting.
And
beyond
way
making
beyond
personal
voting.
changes,
Way.
you have about 30 seconds.
Okay,
Someone
so
watching, what should they do?
one of the things is that we need you to get involved. We need you to know who your representatives are. We need to make sure that community solar passes in the legislature, and then think about how we're going to take back our energy, like power to the people, literally. And when you invest in something like solar energy locally in a community-oriented way, which I have to say the city of Las Cruces has really come out in front on, and I'm very, very proud of this mayor and the
Climate change was a big topic in his state of the city.
Yeah. And the positions of this city. And then when you have that money, instead of it literally leaving New Mexico, but in this case Las Cruces, to Wall Street, to El Paso shareholders, it gets repurposed, reinvested back into our community for the other needs that we need to address, like healthcare and homelessness and all the other issues. And so it's that kind of community-powered action that will really make the difference.
I wish we had more time. I wish we had an hour. Half hour wasn't enough. Mariel Nanasi from New Energy Economy.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. Thank you at home as well. That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers. Nature American Spring Live on KRWG Public Media, April 29th, 30th, and May 1st at 7 p.m. More at pbs.org/American Spring Live. Major support for Nature American Spring Live and this related local programming was provided by the National Science Foundation and the Anne Ray Foundation.